Welcome back, everyone. And those of you that missed a session or two this morning and may be new to our keynote address time, welcome to the opportunity that we're looking forward to in the next hour. Our guest and expert from outside the university coming to us from his current position as Associate Professor of Biology and Associate Director of STEM Transformation at the Institute of at Florida International University. Our guest then is Dr. Bryan Dewsbury, and he's had a career prior to his recent move to Florida International at the University of Rhode Island. He's well known in speaking circles for his work that I'm going to put in the lay language of science education, which I think is what it fits a great deal. He is a fellow with the Gardner Institute, where he assists University of Higher Education to cultivate best practices in inclusive education. While a faculty member at the University of Rhode Island, Bryan received well-deserved attention from a Chronicle article back in 2018, where he described his students as souls that wanted to be awakened. In this article, he conveyed that his role as a faculty was not just dispensing information, but to help students see their potential, overcome self-doubt, and ultimately find purpose and meaning in life. Very much in line, I think, with a couple of our talks earlier this morning. Among his many publications is an article, Deep Teaching in the STEM Classroom, that appeared in Cultural Studies of Science Education in 2019. His research provided evidence for how inclusive teaching practices affect student engagement, learning outcomes, and persistence in college, particularly so for first-generation and underrepresented minority students. So now I welcome you to this keynote presentation, which is titled Equity in the Higher Education Classroom. And remember that after Bryan's address, with a short break, we'll proceed on to have an interactive workshop with Bryan. For all those who can, it'll be a great opportunity. Bryan?
Thank you, Provost. Thank you so much. And glad I was able to join you. Sorry, it's not in person. Sorry, I couldn't be there all day. And it really looked like a great program that you've had so far. I'm very kind of familiar with this time being that week before classes start, where you have an opportunity to really sort of sit and think about what this year is going to look like, right? What's that new thing that you're going to try? And I hope that these speakers so far have inspired you to think a little bit differently about any part of your practice, big or small or in between. I also want to acknowledge that we are perhaps not in very normal times. We are still in the midst of a pandemic. We are still in the midst of some trying times that people are dealing with grief, and I just want to acknowledge that we are not going back to a classroom that is the same as 2018, right? And we're doing the best we can. I know you are doing the best you can. I know you're trying your hardest, and I want to acknowledge the fact that people are in fact trying to do their best in the classroom in spite of what's going on around them. I would like to perhaps building on some of the themes that have already been discussed today. I want to spend the next half an hour or so, maybe a little bit more than half an hour, talking about equity in the higher education classroom. And my hope is that after this conversation, it sets us up for the workshop afterwards, because it will shift your mind away, if it hasn't already been leaning in that direction, from thinking of the classroom as just a place where stuff happens. And by stuff, I mean content and information. Let me be clear. I am not anti-content. I'm not saying that, the biology and physics and literature, whatever, that it doesn't matter. I am saying that the classroom education is fundamentally a human experience. And the more of us who recognize that, the more we recognize that as a community, the easier it is to understand why inclusive approaches matter. I have had the privilege of having this conversation with probably over 80, 85 universities across the United States and Canada. And the conversations, not just a conversation, right? I'm referring to workshops. So we run, full-on workshops. A lot of times they're, 2, 3, 4 days long. And we always begin the workshops by asking the question, if you met your student 10 years from now, 15 years from now, what kind of individual would you have hoped they became? And without fail, like we're batting 100% right now, right? The answers are always along the lines of, I would like them to be critically engaged consumers, good voters, critical consumers of information, good neighbors, good parents, good siblings, good community members. No one to this day has ever said to me, I really want them to remember third order differential equations. I'm sure it's pretty cool, but that's probably not what you care that they remember in 10 years. So the question then is, why when it comes to curriculum design, we get hung up on coverage. I'm going to repeat myself. I am not saying that coverage doesn't matter, but I'm saying that education is about something more. That what happens in the classroom, what happens when you cultivate an academic experience, it has to go beyond subject matter expertise. And I appreciate why this might be confusing for some, because if you are like me, you're raised in an environment where to qualify to teach a college classroom only meant that you needed to be very, very good, like have a PhD in a particular subject area. And if you just took like 2 minutes and think about that, you realize how ridiculous it is, right? So, I mean, think about a medical doctor. What do? Right? They have a STEM major, they go into med school, they have a residency, a fellowship, then you practice. Lawyers are political science, English major, what have you, law school, apprentice, practice. For some reason, we have okayed the fact that we can spend a half a decade focusing on one tiny sliver of one molecule, be the world's expert in that, and then show up on Monday morning and say, oh, by the way, intro bio is over there. You have 150 students. And it's important to acknowledge this because many times when we have these conversations about teaching transformation and progressive pedagogy, we're talking to current faculty, right? It's almost as though we're trying to workshop our way out of our issues. But this conversation would not be complete if we did not address the fact that the mechanism by which we prepare future faculty needs to explicitly incorporate the kinds of strategies we are going to talk about today. So I know we're sort of coming at this from the back end a little bit, but I'm still an optimist. I still am having this conversation with you out of love. Because I've heard the conversation disperse in a different type of way over the last decade and a half, right? So 10 years ago, it was all about, the students who were not prepared and the high schools aren't doing well enough, et cetera, and all this deficit language. Thankfully, much of that has minimized, but then the pendulum swung to demonizing all the faculty who are racist and who wouldn't want to change and Here's the thing. I don't believe, or at least I haven't met a student yet who has said, you know, I just paid $25,000 in tuition, maybe an extra $10,000 for housing. So I'm going to accumulate as many F's and D's as I can. I haven't met that student. I'm not saying that there aren't students who come out with bad grades, but I'm saying I haven't met the one who's gone in, made the investment, and decides that that's the outcome that they want. I also haven't met the faculty member who their primary goal is to fail as many students as possible. And I know some people make it hard to believe that statement, but I actually think deep down inside, even some of the biggest gateway or weed out classes, right? Deep down inside, people actually want to get students excited about organic chemistry. They want to get them excited about calculus 3. They want to get them excited about intro to statistics. So the question then is, if you're willing to be naive with me for a second and have that belief, how do you design a system that empowers both of these actors to be their best selves? Now we're asking different kinds of questions, right? So we're getting away from finding a stakeholder to scapegoat, and we are dealing with a set of policies and procedures that appropriately reward and support people in the kinds of behaviors that we want. And what are those behaviors, right? You want that student to walk on your campus, walk into your classroom, and see and feel represented in the process, whether it's in the textbooks, the material, what you discuss, the class offerings, the makeup of the campus, their connection to you and their classmates. Because here's the thing, the less a student has to think about their sense of belonging, the degree to which they feel connected, do I belong here, the less they have to think about that, the more they could actually just engage and just be. That's the phrase I like to say. You just want to be free to enjoy the academics, enjoy the work, to thrive. You also want students who are open to what I call the awakening of the soul. And I get this question a lot because I think a lot of times when people think about inclusion on a campus, the conversation somehow stops at affinity groups and identity type events that are kind of set up for commiseration and recognition and respect. And I think all of those things are very appropriate to have. In fact, I surely do hope that you have it. But education can't just be the stuff that we cover. Education has to be the opportunities that you are provided to be open to a new experience. So you might have walked on Missouri State believing near and dear to your heart one particular narrative about how the world works, about what history has been like. But I want you to be open to having that questioned. I don't mean attacked. I don't mean disrespected. I mean interrogated. So therefore, you need instructors who see beyond content. You need instructors who are not just cell biologists. You need instructors who are not just Enlightenment period specialists, not just physicists. You need instructors who understand humanity. Who Elizabeth Mohe says in her paper in Reading Research Quarterly 1996, I teach students, not subjects. If you're thinking about the subject matter expertise as the identity around which you revolve your professional practice, then yes, I'm coming here and I'm the world's expert in this, and I will just tell you what I know. If you're teaching students, you're talking about the cultivation of the individual. It's a completely different paradigm. And so therefore, you need to understand that the students are not walking into your class as blank slates. You understand that their high school experiences matter. You understand that the experiences they had in the communities where they grew up matters. You understand that the national conversations around their identity are things that they can internalize, and that matters. And you understand that depending on your class makeup, the way in which they view and perceive themselves can differ depending on context, and that also matters. So the system then needs to say, if you are going to work on this campus, if you are going to teach students, if we are going to allow you, give you the privilege of teaching a Missouri State student, here are the expectations when you are hired. And here are the ways in which we'll support you to get that continued professional development so that you are always learning. You know, people ask me often, or maybe they don't ask me often enough, but I like to articulate it because I feel very often in these spaces, we can spend a good amount of time identifying all of the problems there are in the system. And there are many problems. I'm well aware of them and I study them. But I also want to have a clear idea of where I'm going. And my pie in the sky vision is that you will have an institution of higher education where offices like the Center for Teaching and Learning are just as robust, just as well-funded, just as well-resourced, just as respected as the Office of Sponsored Research. If teaching is really a central mission, if teaching is really one of the main reasons why we exist, this can't be the 1.5 FTE down the hall and we have a bunch of one-off workshops. We have to rethink that model. So I want to give you an example of what this looks like in practice. And you know, this is a paper that the provost referred to. And you know, when I wrote this, it wasn't to, you know, come up with a new, you know, world famous thing. It was to honestly re-centralize some of the voices who have been talking about inclusive teaching in the K-12 world for literally a century. We in science in particular have been ignoring that. So this, you know, this is not new. This is not groundbreaking. Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed is 1970. Bell Hooks, I think, Teaching to Transgress was 10 years later. These aren't new things. So sometimes it takes a little bit, we have to take some time to rediscover things that have already been said. And I try to capture that in this model. And essentially what I'm saying here is that before we get to all the best practices, before we figure out how many clickers we're going to get, before we rush and put people in groups and flip the class and do all of these cool things, we need to develop a relationship with who's in front of us. We need to have an understanding of ourselves and our own sense of purpose and why we do it and what motivates us. We need to understand the students' history, just the macro history, micro history. We need to have that knowledge because that knowledge then informs the choices that you make so that they're not blindly just taken from a list. They are thoughtful and they're done because you know who's in front of you. So I want to give you an example of what this looks like in one of my favorite classes, Introduction to Biology. And it's my favorite class because it's a true inflection point, right? The data is out there. I mean, you know, the term that's used in literature is gateway, and that means people's success or lack thereof in those intro, particularly STEM classes, but you can say the same for history and accounting, there are a few other disciplines, is often predictive of it if they will stay in higher ed in general, not just the major. So our pedagogy in that space is critical. The stakes are pretty high, right? In terms of our retention numbers and how we think about students matriculating through our institution. And I've always felt that in that vein, intro bio is really more about the intro than the bio. I mean, I love bio. I'm a biologist. At least I was trained as one. But honestly, once you are able to get them to be confident about the material and learn on their own and have self-regulation skills, the bio part is not that hard. It really is not that hard. And some of my most beautiful moments as an instructor is seeing them, the moment when they realize that, and those C's turn to A's, and not just A's, but like easy A's. And they stop caring about the grades because they realize there's so much more to know outside of what's being discussed in the classroom. And that's when education's happening. So I'll give you some examples from my class. And obviously, in the time we have, I can't give you all the examples, and we will be here all evening, right? But I'll talk a little bit about myself and then how some of the things I've done is done in response to who I know, right? So I got an opportunity to write about my journey a few years ago for an edited book, and I feel very, very lucky to have the kind of career that really speaks to my soul in a way that nothing else could. Like I mentioned to you, I was a biologist, at least practicing marine biologist, and I loved it. But once I started teaching, everything changed. And I know it's not a guarantee that everyone's doing a job that they feel like a calling, right? There's a job, but then there's a calling. A calling is something you respond to. A job is something you do. So in reflecting on that journey, you know, I spoke about being the son of a pastor. And even though I don't practice, I do reflect on the way in which my dad was insistent on the use of the word pastor, because the word pastor comes from pastoral farming. It's shepherds taking care of sheep. And it's not just taking care of sheep, it's you are responsible. You are responsible for the sheep's health and wellness. So if you lose any member of your flock, that's on you. And that's the approach I take to this class, right? So I went through the look to the left, look to the right era too. But I flipped that speech on its head, right? My first day speech is look to your left, look to your right. That person next to you is going to open a business with you. That person next to you might be a primary care physician. That person next to you will help you solve a math problem in week 10. That person next to you will be a roommate next year. We are all going to thrive. We just have to find a means how to. So I want to get to know my students in a macro level, and I want to kind of give this some context and perhaps draw a line between broader social outcomes and how that impacts who's in your classroom. What you're looking at is a redlining map. In case you don't know what that is, they were maps created by the Homeowners Loan Corporation in the 1930s, which was commissioned by the federal government, who was trying to get America back up on its feet, and they would offer no interest or low interest loans for Americans to buy housing. What the HOLC did was to generate maps like the one you're looking at and color code neighborhoods based on desirability. Desirability for lending. So if you were in the blue and the green zone, these were business owners, landlords, you got no interest or very low interest loans. If you were in the yellow zone, it was considered declining. If you were in the red zone, which is where the term redlining comes from, you either were denied loans outright, or you got it at really, really high interest loans, high interest rates. So you have to understand that the chief mechanism by which the government was supporting Americans to build generational wealth was denied to whole sections of society. And the kind of flip thing you have to realize with that is, if you were in the green or the blue zone, you actually may not even be aware that other people were not getting access to the things that you are getting access to. So this was legal, right? This was legal practice until the Fair Housing Act of 1968. And in Providence, the Providence Journal, after an investigation, reported on a local bank that had a redlining lawsuit brought by the city. And it's one of those things that ended up in an out-of-court settlement, and they paid 1.3 million. This was 7 years ago. And remember, I just said that redlining began in the 1930s. Why am I bringing this up? Many of my students, my friends, walk into my classroom from the city of Providence. They walk in my classrooms from those same neighborhoods where the bank reduced lending while actively exploring its reach in other neighborhoods. And we can spend the entire evening talking about the relationship between redlining neighborhoods, the quality of schools, the relationship between property tax and school resources. And I'm not saying to you that I can solve 100 years of redlining with IntroBio. But I can say, when I understand that students' social experiences up until the point where I meet them involves a plethora of things over which they have no control, at the very least, I can be mindful of using any deficit language. I'm not saying that people can't pull themselves up by their bootstraps. I'm not saying that people can't be resilient. I'm not saying that people can't rise above. But I'm saying that you need to be careful to not just celebrate those who have persisted in spite of, and lose focus from the conditions that resulted in them having to persist in the first place. So we don't drop the standards in IntroBio. We just increase the support structure. So I know their neighborhoods, I know their communities, I know their high school, I know the state, and now I want to get to know them. So I have them write me an essay. This is from National Public Radio. I just copy paste these guidelines because the prompt is beautiful. And it says to describe the values that shape your deepest passions. 500 words or less, no more than a page. And they write the most beautiful essays. And they talk about their lives, they talk about DACA, they talk about their high schools, they talk about their dog, they talk about divorced parents, they talk about drug abuse in the home. And I write my essay and I share it with them. And then what I do is I follow up with what I call continuous dialogue. Because you see, once you read the essays, they're no longer just a student ID number. They're no, even in a big class, you've humanized that process. So for me, there's no such thing as two equal IntroBio classes because they're different human beings. And one of the earlier sessions talk about building connection and being explicit with it. One of the things I will add to that, I didn't attend it, but I heard it was great. One of the things I will add to that is understand that connection can happen at any time. Education, that Monday, Wednesday, Friday, 2 to 2:50 p.m., that's an e-campus thing, right? That's a scheduled thing. Education doesn't necessarily only happen between those times. They happen anytime you interact with any of your students. So that connection can happen in the 10 minutes before class when you're outside the room waiting. They can happen when they come up to you after in droves. They can happen when you walk into them in the quad, student hours, office hours, over email. There are always opportunities to ask more and more questions. So I want to briefly discuss two things that sort of hallmarks of our approach. And again, it's, as you could probably tell in Trubio, there are a lot of moving parts. But I want to give some context around these two strategies. One is what I call opportunities for dialogue. What do I mean by that? I mean group work. I don't even really call it group work anymore. I just say opportunities for dialogue because really that's what it is. And I call it that mostly in response to the fact that a lot of people, particularly in STEM disciplines, wrongfully assume that discussions about diversity, equity, and inclusion can only happen in the humanities or in genetic classes or during the MLK breakfast. And I thoroughly disagree with that. I mean, I understand why, and that's sort of back to the I teach subjects type of mentality. But you don't have to look very far back to see the ways in which science as a discipline was complicit or subservient to the social orders of the day, such that things like eugenics, things like Tuskegee happened with our approval and in some cases enthusiastic support. So yes, I do put them in groups, but I socially engineer the group so that they are ethnically diverse, they're academically diverse, in whatever ways I can imagine. And yes, in the intro bio, we do talk about DNA structure and the base pairs and replication, and DNA is a molecule of life. But as a group, they talk about Rosalind Franklin and Maurice Wilkins and the theft of her data and how that theft led to the discovery of DNA and what women's suffrage was like at that time and how that connects to women in science. Yes, we talk about natural selection and evolution as a core biological principle. But as a group, they talk about until 1974, there were many states that had sterilization programs that mostly targeted women of color. We were a part of that science like everybody else. So if my goal is for them to go forth and be that engaged citizen, be that ethically engaged individual, I need for us and them to engage the darkness of everything we've done in the past so that you understand why it's necessary to be equity-minded going forward. Another common higher ed term that we flip on its head is office hours. We call it student hours. Here's why. As a first generation college student, I could tell you that we are kind of a special breed, right? You don't have access to the hidden curriculum, and so you make assumptions about things that, quite frankly, I don't know where it generates from, but it happens. So I have had students tell me, oh, I thought office hours was when the professor got to check their email, which, like, you thought I could check my email in 2 hours, right? And even if everybody came, my office is not big enough to hold, 150 students. So we changed it to student hours. We actually called it the learning lounge. And we hold it in the basement of the dorm. It's a room with 50 chairs and 3 whiteboards. And we average 30 to 40 students a week. Just a simple change in the dynamic. Because I just want to get you there. I want to get you in the room. Once you're there, then I have a chance, right? Then I have a chance to change your mindset. So in 2014, or at least I should say prior to 2014, there were 3 sections of this class. And it was almost assumed that students from minoritized backgrounds, colored in blue here and labeled URM, would get unproductive grades, which is below a C, about 2 or 3 times the rate as white students. And in section 4, which began when my program began, at least in our first semester, things were more or less the same. All right. This is a journey. This is a growing pain. They have to be able to look hard at the data, regardless of what it says about your teaching, and be willing to improve. And one of the things that we realized we had to do was, if we are really going to teach students and not subjects, we are going to have to cut some of the content and really take a hard look at what actually needs to be covered. And we cut about 40 to 45% of the content over the next 4 to 5 years. And I can tell you by the next fall, we already saw a dramatic change in pass rates, right? Not only completely wiped the gap out, but also students who, students from minorities background actually had 100% pass rate, right? So obviously the pushback is, well, if you're going to talk about less things, then obviously they'll do better. And Brian, they might just fall flat in the face when they go to upper division courses. I said, okay, well, let's take a look at that. So we looked at 4 groups of students. All right. In the gray boxes, that's the first semester of intro bio. The yellow boxes is the second semester, and the 200 level is the sophomore year. So B represents me. And then the other 3 sections are very conventionally taught. In the second semester, S, the person who's labeled S, teaches very much like me, excuse me, and the top box is also conventional. So the 4 possible pathways to the 200 level course, assuming you passed all of it, right, is you can get a full year of no inclusive teaching, so 1, 2, 3, and then top box. Just the second semester of it, so 1, 2, 3, and then S. Just the first semester of it, B, and then the top box, and then or full year of inclusive teaching, which is BS, which is initials. I need to remind you of that. And then 200 level courses, right? So remember that the full year of inclusive teaching had like 45% less content. But when you compare it to C, which is the full year of no inclusive teaching, yeah, it's a half a grade higher. Like, even if these points were the same level, I can say, look, I talked about half the stuff you did, and they're doing just fine. My friends, it's okay to focus your academic experience on teaching students how to learn, because you only really have 4 years with them, and there's no way you can cover all the stuff there is to know in your discipline. So your best bet is to set them up to do that stuff on their own long after they leave your classroom. I want to just quickly dedicate this as we close briefly to the first group of students that I ever taught. I was a grad student. I was in that same, STEM space where you were actively discouraged from teaching. But it was when I took the time to talk to them and hear their stories and have them, describe what it meant to be a first-generation American, a first-generation college student, what pursuing medicine meant to them and their family, and why that mattered, not just in terms of prestige, but financially. You realize that the bio class had to speak to more than just cells and animals and muscle tissues and these things. I had to be aware and create an experience that was responsive to the hopes and dreams that they articulated. So I'll stop there for now, and I think we have a decent amount of time for questions. And this afternoon, there will be less of me talking, a lot less of me talking, and we'll spend pretty much all the time looking at a number of very specific strategies that you will curate for yourself, discuss in groups and kind of decide what's appropriate to your context. But I'm happy to take some questions now on what we just talked about. And so I will stop sharing. And so what we'll do is you can feel free to type questions in the chat if you like, and Eric or Stacy will respond to that. Or if you are bold enough, which shouldn't be that hard, you can unmute and just ask. I would love to see your face if you're willing to, but you can just unmute and ask if you would like to. Thank you so much again.
They're a quiet group.
That's
But after lunch, there were several clapping emojis. And Oster Arenas asked, what was the essay topic that you give to students on that first day in Bio 100?
The title of it is called I Believe. And so the program on NPR, National Public Radio, is called I Believe, and or This I Believe, depending on how you look at it, right? If you look at I think the link was put in the chat earlier. That link will take you directly to what it's called Guidelines for Educators. And it's like a 3-sentence prompt. And it basically asks them to talk about the values that shape their passions. And I literally copy paste from that website because it's actually very well worded. So yeah, I think you can just go to that link and hopefully that answers your question. And just as a follow-up real quick, I don't give that on the first day. I actually give it to them before I meet them, and it's due on the first day. So that way I get to read it before like class is really in session. By the second day I've read all of them.
Okay, next question. Do you have students share their experiences in front of the class? And if so, are they willing, or do you have them share to only you?
I have them share to only me. And I let them know that. That's an important distinction, because many of them write really, really, really personal stuff. And I want them to feel comfortable sharing that. I share mine out loud. I share mine to the class, but they just share them with only me. And it's really kind of important, because when I get a chance to meet them, I don't get a chance to meet all of them one-on-one, but when I get a chance to meet some of them one-on-one, I can kind of go back and reread the essay to sort of remind me a little bit of some more of their social context.
And third question here, wants to know if you could talk a little bit more about network leverage.
Right. So I'll give you kind of two discussions of network leverage. In the paper, when I talk about network leverage, I'm talking about the reality that we as individual instructors cannot be expected to be everybody's superhero. And sometimes the danger in particularly inclusive teaching is this sense that you have to be so empathic that you have to be positioned to solve everybody's problem all the time. And when you are at universities, large universities, as yours is, as mine is, do understand that these universities often have a wealth of resources. They're not always very well organized. I can't speak for your school, but I know at URI, which I love URI, but there was a little bit of if we build it, they will come kind of thing. And there's not enough thought of the end user. And I hate to refer to students as kind of in that term, but there's a sense in which if they need to find help, whether it's mental health help or financial help, you might be amazed at how convoluted we've designed higher ed systems that students end up just not bothering, right? As opposed to actually getting the help that they need, right? So network leverage are the ways in which I could kind of simplify some of those systems for them, right? I bring the tutoring office to my class, I bring career services to my class. I invite friends who are scientists and medical professors to zoom in on class and be guest lecturers in the class. I have an assignment where they apply to a summer research program as part of the class. So I'm not just assuming in some other class or some other place they'll do this, right? I kind of tighten the network around their experience so that they can, some of these services are much more visible to them. The second definition, I'll just say real quick, of network leverage is that we're at a point now, which I think is actually really good, and I hope this is true of your campus, where quite frankly, there are many of you who, a lot of what I've said, it may not be particularly new. Hopefully you heard some new things, but it's not like you never heard of the word inclusion or belonging. And people are trying things in their class, they're dabbling here and there. But what they want now is they want the administration to respond to that. They are now moving from individual person doing something in their class to creating what Adriana Kizar calls communities of change, faculty change communities, right? So network leverage really is, the question is, how do you organize those communities in a way that the organic movements can meet institutional policy to encourage other people besides the choir to do this kind of work? So I hope that's clear. I think I saw Nicole West's hand up.
Yes.
I hope that person still has a question.
I do. Hi, Dr. Dewsbury. Thank you for your presentation today. Hello from a fellow former Florida colleague. I was at the University of South Florida.
Oh, nice. Nice.
I am an assistant professor in the Student Affairs and Higher Ed program. So a lot of what you talked about certainly is familiar to me as a student affairs educator. But I guess my question is, as a tenure track professor, how do you, can you talk about like any pushback you've gotten from students who are expecting more traditional teaching methods and may express their dissatisfaction in teaching evaluations? I don't run into that as much because I teach grad students, but I can imagine at the undergrad level, some students may engage in some pushback.
Right. Yeah. Good question, Dr. West. And I'll preface my answer by saying I recognize some privilege that I have as a male identifying professor who's 6 feet and has a loud Caribbean voice that booms, in a closed room. And all these little things, all these little kind of physical things, impact how students respond to you and how they interpret your message. That some of my colleagues don't have, and especially female identifying colleagues. And that's a problem that's been documented. But having said that, in anticipation of the fact that many of my methods might be new or a little bit startling for students who are expecting a passive experience, myself and my learning assistants, we are as transparent as we possibly can and as explicit as we can as to why we do it. So when we design groups, we tell them why we put people in groups. We actually have an activity to model what a good group discussion is like. We actually read a document called Guideposts, which talks about shared values and allowing people to speak their truth to prepare them for difficult dialogues, right? When I use examples of my own, history of, ancestors from Western Africa and slave trade, like I explain why we discuss these things so that all of these things don't come across as a eat your vegetables type of pedagogy. It's I'm preparing you for a world, right, where you will be expected to have those skills. So John Dewey, says it best, in my opinion. He says, education is not preparation for life. Education should be life itself. So what we live and do here should be representative of that. And I could humbly share with you that I've never had like a student eval hit on this. And while acknowledging, I think some of that is some male privilege that I enjoy, I think some of that also is the fact that we try to be as clear and as explicit as to why we're doing every single thing we do. So thanks for your question.
Awesome, thank you.
Our next question, how do you find intro bio is different for biology majors versus those non-majors?
It sort of depends on the non-major. So there's almost kind of three categories of students. We have majors, and then we have non-majors, but they're needed as a service class to a STEM major. So those are like nursing. Well, no, nursing actually don't have to take it, which is a different issue. But like pharmacy, PT students, environmental science students, those aren't really considered majors at our school because that's separate to bio majors. So those are still pretty engaged. But then there's a third category who might just take the class as a gen ed credit because they need a science credit, right? Yeah. In the past, my URI used to kind of mix everybody into the same space. But they're moving away from that and going to a more kind of majors, non-majors, kind of semi-traditional model. I don't know how I fully feel about that, but I will say that when I've had both students mixed in the classroom, I didn't differentiate my instruction to I hate to use the phrase, but like dumb it down or reduce the rigor. Whether I'm teaching majors or non-majors, I still teach from a standpoint of context, and here's why it matters. Whether you're going to be a businessman, a business person, or a doctor, this is important for you to know. But I will say that now that they have non-majors in a separate class, the person who took over that section may actually take an entirely different approach. So we'll see.
Sure. What are some ways you've kept from getting discouraged during days where students don't match the energy that you put into your instruction?
Did I mention I have a rum collection? Okay, no, okay, besides that, so I think there's actually an underlying question to the question, and that is, self-care. And I want to be very clear that this is something that I take seriously, and I hope you do as well. It's an energizing, but at the same time exhausting process. And so I put myself in a mental space where, even though I appear extroverted, I actually need a lot of introvert time to be able to do what I do when I'm in the physical classroom, right? There are times, I usually don't have kind of issues with energy, but there are times when we say, okay, we're just not feeling it today. Something's off. I don't know what it is. There are times I know what it is, like around election time. That's never a good time. During COVID, we gave ourselves breaks. So there are times when I have to read the room and say, you know what, let's pause. Let's take 10 minutes, maybe either do something on your own, or I might even end class early. It's not often, but there are times when I have to read the room and say, look, man, if we're not here right now, if we're not mentally and spiritually here, then we don't need to just force the issue. But that requires me to have the skills to read the room. I will say that because we set up this kind of platform of, we're going to bring 100% of ourselves to this space every day. And by we, I mean myself and my LAs, right? And we just ask for your reciprocity. We just ask that, you abide by the structure that we set up, and we promise you the following outcomes, right? So because there's some fairness associated with how we discuss that, I think that helps with the energy typically always there. I'm not saying they have to bounce off the walls. I just mean they have to be engaged. Right. They have to be willing to not want to go and check that text message on the phone. They have to be willing to not go and open a new tab and check a different website. That's actually all I ask for. Right. They don't need to be like high wire flyers, right? So thanks for that question.
Yeah. How do you handle teaching to students that must pass a standardized test for licensure and certain content needs to be covered? So like nursing classes, for example.
Yes. So, when I was in grad school, a colleague of mine did a really interesting experiment with physics. He created a class called modeling physics. which, if I remember correctly, they cut a whole bunch of the content and they focused on teaching students on how to derive a lot of the classic physics formulas from first principles. But then there was this other kind of more traditional physics class. I think it was called Physics with Calculus. And I remember this because a lot of the students who took that modeling physics class were students that I taught in biolab because I was a TA. And they would be complaining because they were all preparing for the MCAT. And they're like, you know, an MCAT at that time had this whole physics section. Say, what the hell? Like, we can't, set us up to fail. And oh boy, it was nasty, right? But they tracked those students. And years later, the modeling physics student was scoring 3 to 5 points higher than the physics with calculus students on the physics section of the MCAT. And I know the MCAT has a new structure now than it did back in 2008, but that's pretty high given the kind of schools you can apply to depending on your score. So those modeling physics students did maybe even 50, 60% less content, but they got the understanding to learn all the other stuff on their own. So these are students who, just in directly answer the question, had to go on to a very high stakes standardized exam. But instead of putting himself under pressure to cover everything physics, he taught them that you can actually do these things on your own. And so, I think there's kind of a pedagogical way to address that, but then there's also kind of structural ways to address that. There's a university, whose name I won't mention. They made it such that students had to get a particular grade in anatomy and physiology to get into the nursing program. And they made it such that there were less spaces in the nursing program than the amount of students in the A&P class. So things like that just sets you up for chaos, right? But anyway, the moral of the story is, I don't think that you need to feel the pressure to do all the coverage, right? I think we are gathering enough evidence to show that much of these things they could actually learn on their own.
Okay, so there aren't any more questions at the moment, and I'm gonna go ahead and pause that because we do want to give you a little bit of a break, so at least, hydrate.
Right.
And then we'll start, let's say 10 minutes, and then we'll start back with the workshop.
Yeah, so let's say 1:40.
Yeah.
All right.
And we'll be back in this room. So.
All right, take care, everybody.
All right, thanks.